Our first speaker, Amergin Ó Kai, goes by she, them, and will be our first speaker, registered as green in Colorado as soon as she got out of the Army in 1989, has done nothing more as a green than vote until last February. She's non-binary, trans femme, and has a non-binary grandchild. Welcome, Amergin. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I appreciate everybody showing up for this. I'm quite surprised at how this has blown up. Just to clarify, as I've said, I had done nothing in the Green Party until this last February. Essentially, I registered to vote. I voted Green. I voted for Alf Nader. I voted for Jill Stein, and so forth. And that's been about it. I've been trying to deal with just general life, and then suddenly something came through. I believe it was in Facebook, along the lines of the Green Party has gone full-blown TERF. That was early last February. And I'm like, what is going on? And was shocked to find out what was going on. And so that is what I'm here to talk about, and why suddenly I have been roused from my complacency and have become very active within the Lavender Caucus and gradually spreading out a little bit more. So my point, the topic that I wish to address specifically, I've titled Transmisic Bigotry and the Rise of Anti-Trans Legislation in the US. I chose those terms very specifically. Part of it is the fact that in any of this sort of political, I don't even want to call it exchange. Most of this, it really comes down to almost political warfare. And a lot of it has to do with how these things are framed. And they are very often typically framed, at least as we see them, by those actually engaging in the assault portion of that warfare and using their terms. And one of the most common ones people hear is not transmisic, that seems to be a rather new term, but transphobic. And to address that very term, we often see things along the lines of, it's been going around for years regarding homophobia. Nobody's afraid. You're not a homophobe, you're an asshole. Same goes for transphobes, but the fact is it's not simply transphobia. There is such thing as fear of trans people, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment because there are other fears that I'm going to be drawing a parallel with. Transmisic refers specifically to an irrational hatred of. This sounds like a new, well, it may be a somewhat new term, but the usage of that portion of the word mis is actually very well known, I am sure, to everybody, as in misanthropy, or what we are all quite familiar with, and I would hope have all been battling for some time, misogyny. And I wish to also then, as I mentioned, phobia, make this comparison slightly further. So what we see is very often attempts to curtail rights of people or outright deny them or roll back guarantees of rights. Now, nobody refers to any of this sort of legislation as gynophobic. I don't think we have seen gynophobic legislation since somewhere in the Middle Ages, when people were actually afraid that women might blight their crops. It is misogynist. The legislation we are seeing is not phobic. It is transmisic. And just as misogyny is a form of bigotry, transmesia is likewise a form of bigotry, pure and simple. In conversations in Facebook and more directly, thinking last summer during the national convention, there was a presentation made about trans issues, and one of our opponents, if to put it politely, one of our opponents began spouting some of their transmisic bigotry, and I called them on it in the chat that this is bigotry. They immediately piped up with, "I don't feel safe. Someone called me a bigot." I'll double down on that term every single time. My usual response when someone says I'm not a bigot is that bigot is as bigot does. So what does bigot do? Last year in 2020 set a record for anti-trans legislation, let's say attempts, bills placed in various state and local legislatures. Within states, there was a total of 82 different bills throughout the country in well over 20 states. That record was shattered last March, already 82 in an article on March 13th. The count has gone well over 100 in well over 25 states, closer to, I believe, 30 now. It's hard to keep track of these. At this point, I am using general numbers because it's constantly growing. Many of these, fortunately, have been stopped. But as we've seen, one of the best examples being, many people know of, being Arkansas, where the governor, a Republican, said, this is a bad law. And yet, the Arkansas legislature overruled his veto, passing a bill to deny care to transgender, non-binary youth. I'm going to get back to that a lot. This is, I'm sorry, some of what I'm going to be saying is rather circular because these things keep reflecting each other. So most of these bills that are coming up, for years, everybody's heard of these so-called bathroom bills, and everybody knows it has nothing to do with the restrooms. Most of these bills, those are coming up again. We're seeing a lot of bathroom bills. One of the most recent in Tennessee didn't try to block people from using the restrooms associated with the gender as they identify, but rather is now forcing businesses that do not discriminate to post warning signs publicly to their customers of the fact that they do not discriminate against trans people and that trans individuals may be using the restroom associated with their actual identities. So a number of others we are seeing that are not as well known, but crop up quite frequently, have to do with denying the changing of gender markers on birth certificates, state IDs, and driver's licenses, as well as passports. And it kind of goes up and down in terms of there are at times bills to allow this, and then other states are quickly trying to introduce bills to deny that from being permitted. That has been a tactic going back early into the 90s to attempt to legislate in various states things that cannot be in the future legislated or defined in legislation. Most of these were originally regarding various I'm trying to remember the one in Colorado back in the 90s. Got us known as the hate state. I'm trying to remember exactly what that was about. sponsored by Focus on the Family, but it was attempts to deny protected like sexual orientation as a protected class, attempts to state that states cannot make trans identity a protected class, as well as they're using the same things that they used 20 years ago to try and deny rights to the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community, to now deny this in the same ways these rights to trans and non-binary individuals.
That's so awful. I'm sorry.
I mean, these things should seem very familiar. It's simply a new skin on an old game.
Right.
The worst ones, though, now are coming down more towards, again, as I mentioned, like care to youth. Arkansas has banned a great deal of medical care. Doctors cannot prescribe puberty blockers. It would be illegal. They're criminalizing this. Texas has attempted to not only do this, but further criminalize parents for supporting the trans identities of any of their children by declaring that to be a form of child abuse, opening the door to take those children from parents who support them and place them then in foster care. As a side note, but extremely pertinent, most of the so-called science that these various groups that are pushing these agendas are drawing upon has been trying to claim that puberty blockers are experimental when they have in fact been used in medicine actually for a couple of decades now to address early onset of puberty, other similar issues among cis children, well, cis youth. I suppose once puberty, it's hard, do we call them children or not? But in many ways,
youth
yes.
is a better.
But in many ways, there are times when, well, there are kids. And they are making war on our kids. And in many ways, very directly, they're trying to deny this care. And this is often life-saving care. Within 2 weeks of the bill in Arkansas, there were 4 different cases of attempted suicide by transgender youth that were documented.
Of course.
Now, the science supposedly claiming that, and stating this is dangerous and so forth, are coming through from a few small groups. One of the main ones that these activists like to draw upon or quote is the so-called American College of Pediatricians. This group claims to have a membership of over 600. The investigation could only find somewhere between 50 and maximum 200 people and only 1 employee. There is a group of essentially extremely arch conservative people in the healthcare industry. They are registered with or listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group, very specifically as an anti-LGBTQIA hate group. They've been known for quite a while for claiming and promoting that homosexuality promotes and is essentially equal to pedophilia. They have been promoting as a viable form of mental health the torture that is commonly referred to as conversion therapy, which has been used by various fundamentalist Christian groups for decades with regard to sexual orientation, and more recently is directed towards gender identity, gender nonconforming. Very common to among very conservative families. Your son's playing with dolls. You need to do something about this. We have this form of therapy that will make a man out of him. This is supported by the American College of Pediatricians. This has been outlawed so far in only 20 states. Guess where most of these laws are being supported and most of this legislation is being introduced? You'll find a direct correlation between the other 30 states where it is legal to do this to children and these laws. They're not simply trying to deny care, life-saving care. They're doing it in places where it is legal to, in the guise of health care, torture and abuse children. At this point, the key thing about these, as we are saying this now, Margaret Elizabeth will be speaking further more directly to where we move forward within the Green Party. It comes up now with regard to the amendments to Georgia's state platform, because the documents that they are put in there are the same ones that are being quoted and used by these various groups that are introducing and supporting this transmisic bigoted legislation. They are the same groups. And the simple parallel and very obvious one, once you look at what they are doing and who is doing it, bigot is as bigot does, and what bigot is doing among these Republican states is what is being done is what is attempted in Georgia now and is being challenged. It is identical because it is the same groups that they are drawing upon. The documents that they are quoting come from these groups that have already been linked very directly to various right-wing, pardon?
The conservative.
I don't want to simply say Christian, but sadly, most of them in this country and overseas are conservative Christian groups,
right?
Predominantly, and that's and it's a small minority, and it's paints a great deal of very good people in a very bad light because of it by association, at least among those who, like myself, who are not Christian. And it makes it very difficult, to see past some of that to who really is doing what, and find where our allies actually are. Because most of these are trying to claim, they're trying to claim they are defending children from harmful therapies and trying to present themselves as radical feminists. They are trying to present themselves as a part of the political left, while at the same time, hand in hand with the political religious right. So at this point, I have really little further to add to that, but to pass it then, most of the groundwork for that, and I'm not going to sit here trying to quote a great deal of documentation. Margaret Elizabeth has already laid out most of that, numerous articles that were sent to the National Committee and have been posted in other places that they have shared with the Green Party and members. And so, from this point, I'm going to pass it to them to continue with where do we move forward from here? Because this has been going on for far too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you highlighting the importance of our youth that are at risk and for speaking on this. So thank you so much for your time.